Welcome. Welcome to the Office of State Archaeology's 2019 lecture series. Throughout the year, OSA will be hosting speakers each month to present archaeological research conducted throughout the state and around the region. All lectures are free and open to the public, and this year we'll be continuing to live stream these lectures, and after which they'll be posted to the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources YouTube channel. It's now my honor to introduce today's speaker, Michelle Lanier. Michelle received her undergraduate degree at Spelman College, her graduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill, where she studied in folklore with an emphasis in African diaspora and Black Southern life. Her research interests have taken her to Panama and Ghana to document African diaspora funerary traditions, and her ethnographic work in a Carolina Gullah community led her to the role as liaison to the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Her career in cultural heritage preservation began with community-based work in Orange, Durham, and Alamance counties, and continues through her work as an educator, or did continue through her work as an educator for the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. Michelle served as the first executive director of North Carolina's African American Heritage Commission and is currently the director of North Carolina's Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. In her talk today, Michelle will explore the uses of archaeology, mapping, ecology, land conservation as intersecting tools for expanding and diversifying historical narratives in North Carolina. Please welcome Michelle Lanier.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. And I also want to thank David for being the liaison from the Office of State Archaeology to our Division of State Historic Sites. He's helped us with many significant projects just in the past little over a year, and I'll actually touch upon at least one of those. So good morning. I'll try that again. Good morning. It's really good to see you all. It's wonderful. I'm so honored to be invited to speak because I am not a trained archaeologist. I am a folklorist by training, but within the folklorist toolbox, we have an interdisciplinary set of mechanisms to understand the human experience. One of those ways is through the work that I do teaching at Duke Center for Documentary Studies, where I teach oral history and the ethics of community-based documentary practice and praxis. And then, of course, leading 25 museums and historic sites in the Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. If you're not familiar with our division, just across the street is one of our sites, the state capitol. But we cover from 13,000 years ago at Town Creek Indian Mound to the 20th century at the North Carolina Transportation Museum and the historic Black boarding school, which was once called Palmer Memorial Institute in Sedalia, North Carolina, which was founded by Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and that is the only state historic site that is named for an African American or a woman. So I'm really pleased to be steward of that site, and there'll be others that I'll mention as well in this presentation. I will say that I am a descendant of several historic narratives of the historic sites that I get to lead. But I start here, and I'm sure you're wondering, what does this have to do with archaeology and my title, What the Land Witnessed, in concepts of diversity and inclusion and how we can think about space and place and time to expand our understanding of diverse experiences. And particularly, I'm going to start in a place that I call Afro Carolina. So Afro Carolina is a concept that I have been working with for a number of years, and it's this notion of the Carolinas and the African diaspora aspects of Carolina culture, the threads of which we can see woven throughout both states. But it's also, Afro Carolina is also a place that's derivative of many places. Afro Carolina comes to us from West and Central Africa because of the transatlantic slave trade, from the Caribbean, from Barbados, from other parts of the West Indies. Afro Carolina is Gullah culture, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Afro Carolina is also Shaw University, that's here in Raleigh, the oldest historically black university in the South. But for me, my first notions of what Afro Carolina identity meant came in my grandmother's kitchen. And this is an exaggerated symbol of what my grandmother's kitchen was all about. And can you guess what she served pretty regularly, like communion? Grits. My grandmother, if anything was wrong with you, she would either serve grits to pep you up, or if you can see right here, does anyone recognize that box? Calgon, take me away. So you either needed a bath or a bowl of grits to set you straight. But that was her way of nurturing us. But there was something else that she poured over us, and the wallpaper did look almost exactly like that in the 70s and even into the early 80s. This is a part of the material culture of my Afro Carolina. And in addition to grits, in addition to, Calgon baths, my grandmother poured stories over us, stories of our ancestry, stories of our legacy, stories of Palmer Memorial Institute, where I had 4 relatives to attend, stories of people like this. This is the Lanier family. I am the Lanier. This is my great-grandmother, Aunt Eliza, and her siblings, and their family moved from Fayetteville, North Carolina, near what was called Cross Creek. If you go back and look at the early maps, you know that Fayetteville was called Cross Creek, this particular part of Fayetteville. And their family started a barber shop and even created a pomade that was up for patent. So we got a patent on that pomade, and moved from Fayetteville, North Carolina to Fayetteville Street in Durham, which many of you may know about, Black Wall Street. So at the time of the creation of what is now North Carolina Central University, then even before that in 1898 with North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance, there was this burgeoning, and still is, black community of entrepreneurs, educators, faith leaders, civil rights leaders, and they became a part of that landscape, moving from Fayetteville to Fayetteville Street, all because of their father, my great-great-grandfather, Andrew Lanier, who moved there. And 2 of these, I'm going to try to make sure I keep this mic in front of me because I understand we're live streaming. But 2 of these women went to Palmer. That's May and Edna. And they were there at the same time that Nat King Cole regularly came to visit. The woman who would become Nat King Cole's wife, Maria Cole, was a student there. And they were so young. Unfortunately, their parents died fairly young, and so they were too young to live in the dorms, and so they lived in Canary Cottage. And so this is taking you to 2 places that are significant to me in terms of where remains of my ancestors are buried. Cross Creek Cemetery in Fayetteville. It's a segregated cemetery, but it's quite old. It's actually in fairly good condition. And then Mount Hope Cemetery, which is also in fairly good condition. It's on the National Register. As many of you know, many of our African American cemeteries, particularly in the South, are not in great condition. In fact, our director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, Angela Thorpe, just testified before Congress just last week about the importance of preserving these spaces. Can anyone guess, and I'll repeat for the people who are listening in online, anyone guess why these particular spaces may have fallen into disrepair over the years? African American cemeteries in southern states, in places like Afro Carolina. Who said that? Migration. This would be the number one issue, not only for cemeteries, but also for other what I call African American oasis spaces, like Black Wall Street, like the Haiti Heritage Area, places that you see in listed in the Green Book Guide for Negro Travelers, those Black businesses. Migration is definitely one aspect of a challenge for these spaces, because as families left, and if there is no one who remains to take care of these cemeteries, many of which were private. Think about segregation was so embedded in the social mores of the time that even burying people in the same space was illegal. And so Black communities would come together to create their own burial grounds. So part of our work here in the department is to think about, well, how can we be good stewards of these spaces? How can we make sure that we are understanding what this land witnessed and the narratives that that we can access through them? So also a part of my, and I know it's before lunch, so forgive me, also a part of my experience of Afro Carolina and what the land witnessed, and so we're starting to talk about foodways as it connects to land, is barbecue. Particularly if you, even the barbecue companies that were white owned often had an African American pitmaster. In the case of Scott's Barbecue, which is different branch of my family tree out of Goldsboro, North Carolina, my mother's family, they were Black owned, but also had segregated seating because of the laws of the day. And some interesting stories about Scott's Barbecue, two of which, one is that the original founder of Scott's Barbecue said that the recipe for the sauce came to him in a dream, and that the Holy Spirit gave him the recipe, and then that's why it's so successful to this day. And you can actually find it in Food Lion, and it's all over. But also that someone broke into the store, I want to say in the 60s, and was almost caught. And so the burglar hid in a vat of the barbecue sauce all night. And when in the morning they were found, and the question was, do you want to press charges? He said, no, he's already done his time. He doesn't need to have any further punishment, because we know the Eastern North Carolina barbecue sauce is primarily what? Vinegar and hot peppers. So he had already received. So what does this have to do with land? I think it's really important that we start to expand the notion of archaeology. It's not just about digging in the dirt to access ancient pre-European contact information, although that is critical to our understanding of what it means to be North Carolinians and what does it mean to be on this land. But even as we start to get into the 20th century, the late 19th century, and even the 21st century, how are we connecting the dots to food, to grits, to barbecue, to the movement of people, to settlements, to traditions, to the stories that make us who we are? And so as I pull back and look at the land that holds the stories of barbecue and kitchens that have orange and green and yellow wallpaper and Quaker grits in the deep freezer, as I pull back to say, what's the predecessor story to what this land has witnessed? And for me, it starts with naval stores. Naval stores, it's the industry of pine, the longleaf pine in particular, and we call them naval stores for a reason. Turpentine, tar, and pitch. Many of us have heard that over and over again, the holy trinity of pine, of longleaf pine. But why are they called naval stores? Because we know that turpentine, tar, pitch, resin, rosin, all were critical products to create watertight ships. Why is this a part for me of the story of diversity and inclusion, particularly around the African American experience? Is that the first major industry, the land of the longleaf pine, is naval stores. So the first labor that enslaved Africans were made to do was to clear timber, but also to extract the products of the timber, to the point where we all know that longleaf pine became extremely threatened and the whole industry moved southwest with the Great Western expansion towards Georgia. But what is also really important is I can touch hands with my enslaved ancestors just by experiencing the story of naval stores. It is virtually impossible that anyone enslaved during the early settlement period of North Carolina would not have had some sort of exposure to this industry. And their labor was critical to bringing even more enslaved people over to North America. They're extracting turpentine, tar, and pitch that's being shipped to places like England to make ships watertight so that they can ship more enslaved Africans. So you imagine that circle, if you will. Extracting turpentine, tar, and pitch that is being sent to bring even more people across the Atlantic in the holds of ships. It's humbling, and it's in some ways painful, but as a public humanities professional, it's critical for us to connect those dots, because it's easy to intellectualize naval stores and separate out the human impact. It was also a very dangerous industry. As we move to a different ecosystem, this is representative of the Low Country. Certainly, some of the rice plantations around the Lower Cape Fear. This becomes what I call an ancestral ecosystem of witness. So what were the ecosystems that witnessed our ancestors? What were the trees? What's the flora and the fauna that witnessed our ancestors? This is another way for us to connect the dots and to talk about how material culture, our folkways, our foodways, our historic narratives, and our land, our cartographies, our ecosystems all connect. And so I can go to a space like this and think about Gullah culture. I can think about the first places where enslaved Africans would have disembarked and look for where are the native species. I can look at the Spanish moss, the wetlands, the live oak. Some of them are old enough that they truly are what we call witness trees. At our historic sites, we do have certain witness trees that we know were literally there when, Sherman and Johnston met at Bennett Place to negotiate the largest surrender of the Civil War. And so this starts to allow us to think about new partnerships even in our work. So we can join forces with our historians who are primarily archival, our oral historians who are primarily leaning into the oral narrative, and our land conservationists. And some of our most successful partnerships around protecting heritage spaces is when we can say to our land conservationists that there is a human story here. There was a battle here. There was a Rev War era battle here. This is a place where people disembarked from slave ships, or this is a space where people had their first taste of freedom or liberation, or this is a space where there was a boarding school or a Rosenwald school. And so that when the land is protected, we then also protect the opportunity for researchers, archaeologists to conduct further study, but also for people to say this is a space that is relevant to the history I'm studying. Even more personally, this is a space that's relevant to my ancestors. This is a view they may have seen. They may have seen that hummingbird. They may have heard that woodpecker. And so when I go to this part of what I call Afro Carolina, that's how I can lean in. And this is a fairly small map, but it's, if you would like to learn more about it, you can certainly do a search for the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. But this is one of the first experiences that I had where archaeology, land conservation, oral narrative, historical research all came together to protect a space. And so this space goes from Pender County, North Carolina, and then all the way to just south of Jacksonville, Florida, 30 miles in from the ocean. This is the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, authorized by Congress. And so in this space, Gullah Geechee people, for those of you who don't know, people of African descent who have many African retentions that survived the transatlantic slave trade, that survived the long, centuries-long period of slavery, that survived Jim Crow segregation, and that survived a kind of cultural disposition that rendered these practices as taboo. So even speaking in what we now call the Gullah language was considered a sign of ignorance, but there's been a reclamation of the culture and now a celebration of the culture to say, no, this is a survival. This is something that should be studied and honored as a culture with language, with foodways, with burial belief systems. So you'll often see Gullah grave sites that have decorations. It could be conch shells. It could be a clock with the time that the person passed away. It could be what we call a tended or swept grave. So just like a swept yard, if you've ever seen a swept yard where the yard is not grass, but it's swept so that it almost creates a patio where the dirt becomes hard packed and solid as an extension of the home space to really encourage communal cooking, communal living, and again, it extends the living space. So some people do that with their ancestors' graves as well as a sign that the grave is being tended to or cared for. So we see signs of this that are directly related to material culture and life in West Africa. And many of you have probably been to Charleston. Show of hands, people have been to Charleston. You've seen the Sweetgrass Basket makers. They say they're sewing. They call it sewing, Sweetgrass Baskets. And so the sweetgrass is also a protected part of the ecosystem of Afro Carolina that then allows for the continuation of a basket tradition that can be taken back to, if you were to go right now to Sierra Leone or Senegal in West Africa, you would see the exact kind of basket making traditions. Even some of the words that we use today make their way to us across the transatlantic slave trade, but relate to ecosystem. And I'll give you two. Who here, has ever gone to the movies and bought a box of chocolate covered peanuts? Chocolate covered peanuts. What are they called? Goobers. So goobers is derivative of guba, which comes to us out of the Yoruba language for peanut. Guba. So, and even the way we hear nana and okay and tote, and if you've ever heard the word kuda to refer to a turtle. Even syntactically, how language is used. And it's interesting how much of this relates to land. Of course, guba, peanuts. Peanuts came to us from the transatlantic slave trade as well. As did collard greens, as did watermelon. Now grits, which, come from corn, this was a gift of the indigenous people, American Indians. It's a subsistence food. It's a sacred food that then is taken on by Africans who are here as well as Europeans, as are beans as well, and certain gourds. So, but day clean is another phrase that you'll hear in Gullah syntax to say dawn. So I will meet you at day clean. So this is taking an African phraseology that in their language, day clean, meaning when the day is dawn. So the relationship between land, between water, between cycles of the day and cycles of the year, these are all elements that are being protected in the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor priorities. And one of the things I love about this is we have this map that helps us to understand that culture doesn't really know boundaries. Growing up, I was always taught that Gullah and Geechee culture primarily lived in South Carolina and Georgia. And so to see that, wait a minute, we have the lower Cape Fear around Wilmington, you can actually meet elders who know how to cultivate rice, who feel that they have not eaten unless they've had rice 3 times a day, because rice culture is also a part of the Gullah worldview. So that was something that was surprising to us. And so what we also have is the opportunity to say, well, how can archaeology support that? How can we look at what I call agricultural engineering expertise of people who are descendants of rice growers who were specifically brought from the rice coast of West Africa because they understood how to build the proper mechanisms to keep fresh water and salt water separated to grow the rice. So this is also another example of how the land is speaking. Freedom Roads. North Carolina has the most federally designated sites of freedom seeking or underground railroad history of any state in the South. This is under the auspices of the African American Heritage Commission. I was proud to be a founder of this. But we have to look at the land to give us evidence of that, as well as the written record, and not just land, water, the blueways. North Carolina has the first river in the nation to be designated as a route to freedom, the Pasquotank River up near Elizabeth City. And then swamps. A lot of times when we think about Underground Railroad, we think about Harriet Tubman, we think about the Drinking Gourd, the North Star, and we think about Canada and Ohio, maybe New York and Massachusetts. But what we have found is that many freedom seekers were actually hiding out in the swamps right in the South, and sometimes going even further south into Florida, or into the Dismal Swamp, which had a huge maroon population of people hiding out even until the end of the Civil War. Generations were actually born in that swamp and were living of what was called an extra legal life of doing really naval stores work, timbering work, woodwork, to survive. So this is another way that the land and the water speaks to us. And through our music, North Carolina has an African American music trail. I call one aspect, so this is a multi-genre experience, but it's impacted by the land. It's connected to the land. When you have a fairly agricultural people, one of the things that you're going to find is, what kinds of recreation to let off steam can they create, and not just work songs, but also worship songs, also songs for courtship, songs for mourning. So then we start to see the blues. We see even hip hop come later as a derivative of this. And then we also see what I call tobacco funk. Tobacco funk. Because what we know of as funk music with George Clinton, or even one of the fathers of funk, James Brown, a lot of that sound comes out of North Carolina, specifically Kinston, North Carolina. And the land and the material culture, the built environment informed that, because it was the tobacco auction houses when it was off season, that became a space for people to come and dance to music, from guest performers like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, but they were also creating their own music. We have the International Sweethearts of Rhythm here, and one of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm went to Kinston and taught music, and she taught those students at a high level of professionalism. Because of the Great Migration, she had gone north, she had gone west, and she had been exposed to these different ways of performing, these different ways of expressing herself through dress, through sound, and she brought that back to North Carolina. And in particularly Kinston, we then get Maceo Parker and Melvin Parker and Nat Jones, who wrote the music to I Feel Good. And I can go anywhere in the world right now and say, I feel good, and you would know what to do. No, 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 right? Anywhere in the world. And so, but that sound is influenced by people who are rising up out of an agrarian bondage into a hope for freedom, into their own schools, into their own churches, into their own businesses. And so the level of dignity, the level of performance, the level of self-determination is extremely high in the mid 20th century. And so it's showing up in the music, this kind of sharp sound that is informed by people coming up out of agrarian bondage, out of a landscape that had held them, and now they are liberating themselves through self-determination. And so I also think it's important. I started by looking at an interior. A lot of times when we think about archaeology, we think about the witness of land. We're thinking about these large landscapes, and I do have a few more landscape slides that I want to share. But I think it's so important, and the thing that I love about my colleagues in archaeology is that you look at the minute. You look closely, I mean, microscopically even, at a singular element. And here I have two. And what I've done is I have overlaid a human face on a piece of built environment. So the brick, I'll point to it. Do you all see that there is a divot there? How many of you have been to Stagville? Okay, if you haven't, one of the treasures of Stagville are the handmade bricks made by enslaved artisans, enslaved brick masons. And some of the bricks show fingerprints or the gripping of fingers. This is a material connection from one era to another. This allows us to humanize the story of slavery. A lot of times we don't hear names, we don't hear faces, we don't see faces. But in terms of Stagville, we're very fortunate that we have extraordinary records. And so we know about the Hart family. I, too, am a descendant of Stagville. On my father's side, the McCullers. And so here we see the handwork of an enslaved artisan. And I have overlaid here one of the enslaved ancestors who survived to see freedom. Another example is I've been working lately to prioritize the telling of American Indian narratives at our state historic sites. Really, this has been, I would say, a void in our historic interpretation. And this is Magazine Springs. What might look like something fairly mundane, you know, here's a grate, a metal grate, and stonework. To this young woman who's Miss Junior Halawasaponi, this is sacred. It's sacred to her people because it's a sacred spring. It's a natural spring that was sacred to her people. And so we were able recently to work with the Office of State Archaeology and our craft services team and our team at Historic Halifax and the Halawasaponi tribe, most importantly, to clean some vegetation out of that spring and to create a reproduction spring house that's exactly like the one that once sat there. I invite you to go and see it. It was dedicated not just with a ribbon cutting. It was important that it was on Halifax Day, but it was also dedicated in the language of the Halawasaponi. And so I shared this example because both this brick and the spring, for me, signify the opportunity for us to have really healing experiences through public history, through the power of witness, through the power of looking very closely at the most minute of sacred objects to a people and to a community. Because I think what we think of as grand is not always a large building. It's not always a Victorian building. It's not always a granite structure that's the state capitol. Sometimes it's a divot in a brick. Sometimes that's the signature. That's the through line that gets from one human heart across time to another. Sometimes it's a sacred spring. And even looking out across land, you may see, a slight rise in the hill, but these were earthworks. These are earthworks at Fort Anderson, which is also called Brunswick Town. And this is a place where there was a collision of culture. It's one of our most, I would say, significant archaeological spaces. This space, as well as Town Creek, great deal of research that has been done and a great deal of research has continued. One of the things that's really important about Brunswick Town Fort Anderson is with sea level rise and climate change and erosion, this space has become increasingly vulnerable. The silver lining to that is with erosion, more artifacts are washing up, but sometimes they wash up faster than we can grab them. And so this is another opportunity where we get to work with land and coastline conservationists, our archaeologists, and our historians to try to quickly respond to the needs of this space. I mean, this is really unlike any other place that I've been to, in that we have this early settlement story, we have a colonial story, we have the seat of royal government, we have a Civil War story. We're currently trying to identify where a contraband camp was at Fort Anderson. These were formerly enslaved people who are really refugees of war and refugees of slavery. They're freedom seekers who are trying to make a new life for themselves, but of course exposure to disease at the time of the Civil War in this space made it very hard to even survive. Another really important part of these earthworks is the hands that built them. We know that Lumbee and Wakamasuan people were forced, they were impressed to build earthworks, Confederate forts in Brunswick Town, Fort Anderson at the time of the Civil War, as well as Fort Fisher. So when I look at these, I'm encouraging all of us to look at landscapes, trees, ecosystems, flora, fauna, a fingerprint in a brick, a spring, with new curiosity and a new kind of ravenousness for digging deep into almost like an inventory of who were all the different kinds of people who were impacted by these spaces, who impacted these spaces. What are the resonances that we have maybe been missing? And so, and this is what I've been challenging myself to do, and I encourage you to do so as well. I am definitely open to taking taking questions, and I'll repeat them. Any questions for those who are watching online? I'm happy to also go back to any of the slides, particularly the maps, if you want to talk about those. But I'll close out here. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes. 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 Right. Sure. So I'll summarize the question. The question from the audience is an archaeologist who's out in the field and may be in a cemetery where the stones are either illegible or it's unmarked. What kinds of records can we access to make sense of what it is that we're looking at? I think that my answer is twofold. I think that it's up to us as public humanities professionals to fill in the gap around the record. And I think we have to start with the communities. So I call it a concentric circle approach. So whoever's closest to that cemetery. The people who've lived there the longest, we start there. And then we find out, even if it's just a fragment of a name, that we can maybe search and find people who may have moved away because of Great Migration. The oral narrative, oral history is really important when it comes to African American cemetery preservation. But then I think on the flip side of that, with the oral narrative, we can shore that up with our technology, our ground penetrating radar. The other thing is using the tools of folklorists to understand what you're looking at. So I've seen really sad situations where people have cleaned up a cemetery, where they have taken field stones away, where they have taken shells or grave decorations away. And that really is removing the markings, not only of the fact that there are human remains there, but that is specifically an Afro Carolinian grave site, and may even be a Gullah grave site, depending on the characteristics of the grave decorations. And so I think educating ourselves to say, just because we don't see something in the archival record doesn't mean that we can't have it codified by the oral narrative, and then use technology to do that, and then try to not disrupt. And try to encourage our developers. They're the ones that we really have to keep an eye on, all of us, from not disrupting or cleaning up, or even well-meaning people who say, oh, this looks messy, this needs to be tidied up, to try to educate people to say what looks untidy to you is actually beautiful to this particular community or beautiful to this particular family. I hope that helps. Okay, great. Other questions? Yes.
I'm here from New York City working with the historic Jarvisburg Colored School in Currituck County.
Wonderful.
Which was founded, we think, by a freed slave, William Hunt, in 1868.
Wow.
It was moved across the road.
Yeah.
The floor was added in 1911, and the elders have taken that school back
Yeah.
and restored it.
Yes.
It's now a little teeny museum. But my question to you, there are 5 other Rosenwald schools in Currituck. Are there other schools that predate the Rosenwald schools in North Carolina?
So yes, there are definitely schools that predate Rosenwald schools. So if we were to really call Rosenwald schools what they were, we would call them Washington Rosenwald Community Schools. They would have those 3 names because it was the idea of Booker T. Washington, who was friends with philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, who was the head of Sears and Roebuck, and really Rosenwald gave seed money. So no more than really a third of the funding for Rosenwald schools came from him. The rest had to either come from local, county government, but a lot of it came from sweat equity and fundraisers from the community. So you had stories of, women coming home after cleaning in someone else's house and carrying bricks in their apron to build them. So that period is important. But even before that, the very first schools in North Carolina for formerly enslaved people were right on the plantation. So as soon as people were experiencing liberation, what they would do, this was all over the South really, is they would create, the first thing they want to do is, create a place of worship that doubled as a school and be able to marry. So you'd want access to marriage rights, reading, and worship. Those are usually the first things. So we see it at the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony, which was a freedmen's under the Freedmen's Bureau. You saw it at the Trent River Settlement, which was James City, right outside of New Bern. You would have seen it in Princeville. So any of the emancipation communities, you definitely would have seen it. Even under brush arbors, until they could have created structures, there was education happening. Now, are there still buildings that exist? I would wager to guess that on some of our antebellum sites that are maybe even in private hands, that there would be some old structures potentially that were used, but it was always church and school together. So you would teach all week long and worship on Sunday, and that was the common tradition. Yes, what they call plantation schools that started right as freedom emerges. So as some enslaved people were still staying on plantations for lack of access to other opportunities, or they were staying on a sharecroppers, they would often have a building right there in those spaces as well. Other questions? Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I hope you have a good afternoon.
On behalf of the OSA, I'd like to thank Michelle Lanier for spending time with us today. Please join us next month for a talk by Dr. Anna Agby Davies, who will be talking about archaeology at the Pauli Murray House in Durham. So thank you so much for joining us.